Caution! The AJ and Quill show contains D&D content and is intended for a D&D audience. And, besides that, they're really weird. Hi everyone, welcome to Meta Adjacent Player University. I'm Professor AJ, your friendly neighborhood tiefling, and here's my lab assistant, Quill the Dragon. Say hi, Quill.
Greetings all. Prepare to absorb the knowledge Quill dispense with his mighty jaws.
We're going to be discussing player tactics for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
We're going to be covering general combat tactics, as well as specific tactics for each class in future episodes.
Right, but let's not waste any more time. Class has begun. Let's get started.
So what are we covering today in class?
Today's class is Ability Profiles 101. Open your textbooks and let's get started. Now, first thing we're going to be covering is what this is and what this is not.
This is not a min-max guide.
Right, we're not going to be telling you how to build your character. We're going to be showing you how to use your character so that they are more efficient in combat.
Min-maxing is when players try to squeeze every possible advantage out of their character, while also trying to minimize every disadvantage.
And this is totally legitimate style of play, it's just not what these videos are about. I tend to find that min-maxers theorycraft inside of a vacuum, and they have a habit of neglecting or ignoring the role-playing and exploration part of Dungeons & Dragons.
This is a fine way to play, and can be very fun. Unfortunately, it means that your character who is optimized for combat won't be able to shine in any other area on its own.
If you look at build videos online, you'll tend to see people asking for optimized builds. Unfortunately, that usually means optimized for combat only.
Combat is only one of the 3 pillars of the game, the other 2 being exploration and role-playing.
Right, and I've also found that generally a lot of min-maxers tend to use min-maxing as a way to compensate for bad tactics.
Your level 1 mountain dwarf with 18 strength and 18 constitution doesn't need good tactics when fighting, because it relies on its statistics to carry it through.
Now, min-maxing can be a lot of fun and it has its place, but this methodology tends to fall short once the monster tactics start to improve a little bit.
And if you've been watching our monster tactics videos, this is likely to start happening.
Now, personally, I prefer to play a character that I can roleplay and have a lot of fun with, and then just optimize my tactics.
You don't need to optimize a character's statistics for combat. You can simply optimize your combat tactics.
So Lesson 1. Understanding ability scores.
Each character has 6 main ability scores that they use.
That's Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma.
What kind of character have you made?
Right, is your character muscle-bound, yet also insightful?
Is your character brilliant, but charming?
Or is your character really nimble, but also hardy?
Ability scores define these qualities of a creature.
They show a character's assets as well as their weaknesses. An ability score is the pen and paper representation of how your character experiences and interacts with the fantasy world.
In the game, there are 3 main kinds of rolls you will make with the dice. An ability check, a saving throw, and an attack roll.
Now, these rolls all rely on your 6 stats. Now this means that your statistics, more so than even your class, are what are responsible for determining your role in combat.
This is emphasized even further because certain classes highlight different ability scores above others.
Like how wizards have to use intelligence for casting, and a rogue has to use a finesse or a ranged weapon to make a sneak attack, which highlights dexterity.
But let's go over the stats. Strength.
Strength represents physical power.
It's how you deal damage in melee combat.
And strength is also how well you can resist being grappled or shoved around in combat.
It determines your athletic score.
And it's responsible for any saving throw that would try to move you or bind you somehow.
Dexterity.
Dexterity represents your agility, your reflexes, and your balance.
It's how characters avoid damage inside the game.
And it's how you deal damage with a finesse weapon or a ranged weapon.
Dexterity also determines your combat order via the initiative.
Right, dexterity is also responsible for your stealth and sleight of hand skills.
And saving throws made to dodge magical projections and explosions. Constitution.
Now, Constitution is the game representation of your health, your vital force, and your endurance.
It determines how much damage you can absorb via your hit points.
It's also the one used for saves that determine your resistance to poison, disease, or any magical effect that would alter your physiology. Now, strength, dexterity, and constitution represent your physical skills. The next skills will represent your mental skills.
Intelligence.
Now, intelligence represents your reasoning and your memory.
Wizards and artificers use it as their spell-casting ability. It determines their spell attack bonus, their saving throw DC, and the number of spells they can know per day.
Intelligence is also responsible for your arcana, history, religion, investigation, and nature skills.
Intelligence is used for saving throws for disbelieving certain illusions and resisting mental assaults that could be refuted with logic, sharp memory, or both. Wisdom.
Now, wisdom represents your perception and your insight.
Clerics, druids, and rangers use wisdom as their spell-casting ability.
Wisdom is also responsible for your perception skill, which is a very common role that most player characters will be making throughout their adventuring career.
Wisdom determines saving throws to resist effects that charm, frighten, or otherwise assault your willpower.
And wisdom is also responsible for the skills of your insight, your animal handling, your medicine, and your survival skills.
Charisma.
Now, charisma represents your force of personality.
And it's the paladin, sorcerer, and warlock spellcasting ability.
Now, charisma is responsible for all your social interaction skills. That's performance, persuasion, deception, and intimidation.
Charisma is also responsible for saving throws to withstand effects such as persuasion that would subsume your personality or hurl you into another plane of existence.
Now that we've gone over all the ability scores, we're going to go over something we call an ability profile.
Tip: if you want to be effective in combat, simply reduce your opponent's hit points to below 0, while simultaneously keeping yours above. Works every time.
This is an oversimplification, but it's essentially true. Characters need to be able to do damage while simultaneously keeping their own health above 0 to win a fight.
This is where ability profiles come in. It tells you how to behave in combat.
How you determine your ability profile will depend on two main things. Look at your stats and determine which of your statistics you use for attacking most.
This is your main offensive ability, and could be any statistic besides Constitution.
Exactly. Casters would use one of the mental stats, and a fighter would probably use strength, a rogue would use dex. You get the idea.
Next, you need to determine what your main defensive ability is.
So that's whatever ability you're using for your main defensive stat. That's either going to be dexterity or constitution, and that's determined on whether your character is more likely to try to absorb a hit via its hit points, or if it's going to try to dodge or avoid the hit entirely.
If they absorb the hits, it's Constitution. If they avoid the damage, it's dexterity.
Now what characters will do is they will assign their two highest stat rolls to one of these two abilities.
Their main defensive stat and their main offensive stat.
And certain combinations of these main offensive stats and defensive stats create what we call an ability profile.
Different ability profiles favor certain generalized styles of fighting to make them more efficient in combat.
Also, because different classes highlight different abilities to use, this makes them better or worse at different ability profiles and different styles of fighting.
But it might be easier to show you what we mean. Let's cover our ability profiles.
Ability profile number 1.
Tank.
A tank character is a character whose main offensive ability is strength, and their main defensive ability is constitution.
Tanks are also known as a melee tank, a brute, a frontliner, meat shield, frontline fighter.
Right, you get the idea. Whatever you call them, this is the ability profile.
Tanks are melee range stationary weapon users who defend themselves by absorbing damage.
Now barbarians, wild-shaped druids, fighters, and paladins all suit the tank profile.
For their role, tanks engage in melee combat.
That's close range. That would be between 5 and 10 feet away from the opponent.
Tanks engage directly in melee combat with the bulk of the enemy forces and occupy the enemy's attention.
A tank's main focus in melee combat is to occupy the enemy's attention so that it's away from the squishier characters.
Right, tanks deal damage, but more importantly, they soak damage that would probably kill less robust characters.
Ability profile number 2.
Skirmishers, or a Dex Tank.
So a skirmisher's main offensive ability is dexterity, and its main defensive ability is constitution.
They are a mobile melee to medium ranged weapon user who relies on absorbing damage to protect themselves. These are also known as off-tanks, mobile tanks, or guerrilla fighters.
Now, fighters using finesse weapons or ranged weapons, rogues, rangers, blade-packed warlocks, open-hand monks, all suit this ability profile quite well.
A skirmisher's role in combat is a mobile damage soaker that wears down opponents with moderate but consistent damage over time.
Now, a skirmisher is going to roam the perimeter of the battlefield at a distance approximately equal to their total speed away from the main front line where the tank is.
Skirmishers screen allies using tactical positioning to protect them from enemy advances not covered by the main tank.
This is like if a group of enemies breaks off from the bulk of their forces to go around the main tank to start attacking your casters or your range characters. The off-tank or the skirmisher's job is to intercept them so that they don't get to the squishies.
And they do this while trying to do as much consistent damage as possible. Even when engaged in melee combat, these off-tanks should still stay quite mobile, moving around but within range of their opponents to position for flanking, to prevent blocking ally strikes, and for quick escapes or to provide cover for their allies against enemy attacks.
Now, something to know about skirmishers is they really shouldn't stay in melee combat for more than 2 rounds.
They move in, they attack. The next round they attack and move away.
If they're able to. If they're locked in combat, then there's no way around it. But this is generally how they should behave.
Use your own discretion.
Now think of skirmishers or off-tanks as kind of a melee controller. They use their tactical positioning and physical presence to control enemy movement and to provide advantage to their allies via flanking and cover. Ability profile number 3.
The hit-and-run fighter, otherwise known as melee DPS. That's damage per second. It's an MMO term that we are subsuming into 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons simply because most people understand what it means. A melee DPS's main offensive ability is either strength or dexterity, and their main defensive ability is dexterity.
Now, these hit-and-run fighters are mobile, melee-ranged weapons fighters who avoid damage as a way to protect themselves.
These are otherwise known as strikers, shock attackers, ambushers, sneak attackers, or alpha strikers.
Barbarians, monks, rogues, and blade-packed warlocks all suit this ability profile perfectly fine.
A hit-and-run fighter's main role in combat is to stay near the front line where the tank is,
at a distance of about half their total movement.
For a human, that would be 15 feet away. For a dwarf or a halfling, it would be 10. From this position, hit-and-run fighters move in to engage with key opponents when they are able to strike for maximum damage. And then they return to their original spot.
Hence the hit and run. They go in, they attack for maximum damage, and then they leave.
These melee DPS should constantly be repositioning themselves in order to gain the most advantage to their attacks as possible.
And for this they would use flanking, stealth, or cover. Now, melee DPS, or hit-and-run fighters, should avoid prolonged melee engagements at all costs.
They don't have the constitution nor the hit points to be able to sit in melee combat.
And because of their dex score, it shows they're meant to be avoiding combat and damage.
Hit-and-run fighters do as much spike damage as possible, even at the expense of not doing any damage on one round, so that they can set themselves up to do maximum damage on the next round.
Right, like how a rogue spends a whole turn sneaking and hiding around to get a flanking position so that on the next turn it can use a sneak attack to kill an opponent.
But that's just one example.
Right, they get in, they hit hard, they get out. And they should avoid staying in melee combat for longer than one turn. Now, so these were 3 ability profiles: the tank, the skirmisher, and the hit-and-run fighter.
The tank is stationary and absorbs damage. A hit-and-run fighter is mobile and avoids damage. A skirmisher is a blend of the two. They are mobile, but they also absorb damage.
Ability profile number 4.
The sniper.
Now, a sniper is a long-ranged, stationary weapons user who protects itself by avoiding damage. Now, the sniper's main offensive ability is dexterity, and its main defensive ability is also dexterity.
with wisdom pulling a little weight on the side. They're also known as marksmen, ranged DPS, and archers.
Now, fighters with the archery fighting style, rogues, and rangers all suit this ability profile very well.
For their role, it's important to remember that unless it is a hit-and-run finesse weapon DPS fighter, characters with low strength and constitution,
Like the sniper profile.
should stay out of melee combat as much as possible. They just aren't as effective here.
Snipers are long-ranged characters.
They need to stay far away from opponents, between 35 feet and the maximum normal range of their weapon.
For example, if they're using a longbow, that would be between 35 and 150 feet. Now, snipers at range should position themselves behind as much cover as possible, while still being within full view of the entire battlefield.
If they're behind half cover, that's +2 to their AC and dexterity saves. If they're behind 3/4 cover, it's +5 to their AC and dexterity saves.
And when a sniper is not attacking, they should be getting behind as much total cover as possible.
Since snipers are away from the front line, wisdom provides a mental defense against debilitating effects.
Wisdom also boosts perception, which, as a sniper, you're going to want to be able to perceive well when you're looking at a battlefield.
You have to find those sneaky hidden enemies.
Ability profile number 5.
The support caster.
A support caster's main offensive ability is one of its mental stats, whichever one it's using for casting, and its main defensive ability is Constitution.
These are also called buffer debuffers or healers. It's the typical cleric role.
Right, but bards, druids, clerics, paladins, and divine soul sorcerers all fit this ability profile very well.
They are a medium-range stationary spell and weapons user, and they protect themselves best by absorbing damage.
For their role in combat, support casters will position themselves close to but behind the front line,
That's where the tank is.
trying to stay at approximately half their movement speed away from the front line.
They're there so they can provide the front line with healing support, as well as to cast short-ranged, concentration-requiring buff-debuff spells.
Like Bless.
And then, after casting these healing or buff-debuff spells, they return back to their original position, away from the front line.
This is an in-and-out combat style similar to the melee DPS. They use half their movement speed to get to the front line, they cast their healing spells with their buffing spells, and they retreat back to their original position using the other half of their movement.
They also advance to the front line so they can get close enough for most of their short-range buff spells, like Spirit Guardians or Lesser Restoration.
Ability profile number 6.
Caster DPS, also called a Spell Slinger, Glass Cannon, Spellcaster, or a Blaster.
Now, a caster DPS is a long-range stationary spellcaster that protects itself by trying to avoid damage.
Bards, Trickery Clerics, Arcane Trickster Rogues, Sorcerers, Warlocks, and Wizards all fit this ability profile.
Now, for their role in combat, they're meant to stay as far away as possible from the front line.
Between 30 feet and the maximum range of their shortest range spell. And, like snipers, they should be staying behind as much cover as possible.
Their role is to cast spells into combat while trying to stay as far away from the front line as possible.
Caster DPS or Spell Slingers typically focus much less on battlefield control spells and much more on dealing direct damage with their long-range spells.
And because they typically have a lack of any kind of good armor class or hit points, they try to compensate for this by having a high dexterity and staying away from melee combat, and by getting behind as much cover as possible. Now, where does your character fit in these ability profiles? An easy way to check is to look at your character stats and how you've been playing.
What statistic are you using most often to attack your enemies?
Once you know that, then you can figure out whether your character typically absorbs damage using its hit points and armor, or if it tries to avoid damage by staying out of combat or being nimble and moving around.
Once you know these two stats, you can figure out what ability profile your character best fits into.
Now, something to remember is that just because your stats read one way for an ability profile doesn't mean you're locked into that forever.
For example, if you have high strength and constitution, but you don't want to play as a tank, you can still play a perfectly fine skirmisher.
Now, this just means that, according to your profile, you could make a better tank, but that doesn't mean you're going to make a bad skirmisher at all.
Another example is how wizards and warlocks make iconic glass cannon spell slingers, but they are also great support casters. They just tend to focus more on debuffing and controlling enemies rather than buffing allies.
Now, these ability profiles are just intended to give you a direction on how to be more efficient in combat, but that doesn't mean you can't be effective going a different direction.
Although if this happens, a good question to ask yourself is, why are you going another direction when you've arranged your stats a certain way?
And this doesn't have to be a good answer, but as long as you have some kind of internal logic for doing so, then you're fine. So I hope this helps you get started understanding ability profiles and your ability statistics for your player characters.
And we hope it starts you on your way to give you some direction on how to behave tactically in combat.
And in the future, we're going to be covering each class as a 101, going over their specific roles and combat tactics and how to use them efficiently.
So stay tuned for future episodes.
And remember, guys, have a good night. We love you all. And is it time for school yet? Have a good one.
Bye.
Yeah, 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 yeah.